Hello, I am Brother Francisco Whitaker, Benedictine monk of St. Vincent Arch Abbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and you are watching The Benedict Project. So today we're going to kind of shift gears from the typical kind of videos that we make to look at a very interesting topic, which I know a lot of people have questions and uncertainties about, yet affects a lot of individuals, which is the Church's teaching on the validity of marriage. We face in the culture a lot of unfortunate situations of divorce. And in the Catholic Church, we teach that divorce is not an option, right? Divorce is not acceptable by Christ, and it was not in God's plan. However, there's an acknowledgement that perhaps a marriage never existed. So the divorce, in the secular terms, severs a marriage completely. Well, the Church would say if there is a valid marriage, if the husband and wife came together truly, then you could never separate it. However, there could be reasons in which that joining together, that bond, was actually never established, so that it looked like there was a marriage, but there never was one to begin with. They had an invalid marriage. And the declaration of nullity, or an annulment that Catholics can get, is basically a declaration saying there was no valid marriage. The marriage was invalid from the beginning, so that they are now free to marry another. Now, you probably know someone who has had an annulment, but maybe you didn't know why, or why they were able to declare that this marriage was invalid. So I thought it might be interesting to slowly walk through the reasons that the Church's law, Canon Law, gives for how a marriage can be determined to be invalid. What are some underlying principles that are followed to investigate the validity of the marriage between a man and a woman? Now, there are a lot, so I'm not going to spend this video singularly looking at everything, but rather taking a three-part series to look at the three main areas where the Church investigates validity, which are impediments, defects of consent, and defects in form. So today we'll look at what are called the 12 diriment impediments. What are states or things that are existing already, realities within man or the woman, circumstances, whatever, that directly affect the ability for the marriage bond to be formed. I have my notes out because I don't know this stuff completely off the top of my head. And full disclosure, I am not a canon lawyer. I have not studied canon law to an exceptional degree. I've taken a few classes of it in seminary and a very good teacher. And I think what I've learned is definitely sufficient enough for everyone to hear. So, with that being said, here are the 12 impediments that can invalidate a marriage. All right, number 1, age. Simply, if the man or the woman is not old enough to get married, marriage is invalid. So the age designated by the Church can be, generally, is different from the civil age. So in the Church, a woman cannot be married until she has completed her 14th year, and a man until he has completed his 16th year. So we don't really see that particularly often, and we don't see 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds getting married because they're still living at home, and I would never want to see a 14 and a 6-year-old get married. But in the Church, that is the lowest bar, and they have to at least be that old. Although the Church also would say most of the time, lean into society's custom. So in the United States, it is generally 18 is the acceptable age. But there are other countries, right, and canon law is universal, so it applies to all Catholics. There are countries, maybe in the Middle East, Africa, or in Asia, that marry younger. So this is at least declaring 14 and 16. So that's the first. If you get married under that age, your marriage is invalid. Second is impotence. And this originates in the natural law. This is not something that is imposed by the Church, but rather it is integrated into the natural law. And what is meant by impotence? So pardon me if some of these language is a little uncomfortable for you. This is just the law. This is how it's presented. So impotence means the inability to have sexual intercourse. Now, this isn't saying something like erectile dysfunction, which can be medically taken care of. That means that at some point, right, sexual union is possible, but rather the marital act is impossible because the man is unable to do it. I don't know however else to say it. I could be, really clear. Penetration isn't possible, basically, is what it's saying. Now, this also doesn't mean sterility. So if the man or the woman is incapable of having children, that is not what is meant by impotence, but rather the inability for the marital union to be consummated at all on a physical level. Because we believe in the church that the union of the marriage exists on a twofold moment. The moment of declaring vows on the altar, but then second and completed, consummated, made final through the marital act. And if that cannot be done physically ever at all, then the marriage can be declared invalid. Now, there's some more definition to this. This impotence must be antecedent, not consequent to the marriage. So the man must already be impotent, must already know he is not able to do it before they get married, not afterwards. And it has to be permanent and not temporary. So maybe there are times of the year, maybe because of his health or whatever, that he's not able to function properly. But when he's healthy, he's fine. That's totally understandable. But if no matter where he is, what he's doing, or how he feels, he's unable to enter into marital union with his wife, then he is declared impotent, and the marriage will be then declared invalid. All right, the third impediment is having a prior bond. And there are a ton of things that classify as prior bonds, and we'll kind of go over this pretty quickly, though. So basically, a prior bond is any tie that this person has to another, whether that other is another spouse or to the church in some form of a vow. So that this is why divorced Catholics, if their marriage has not been annulled, are not allowed to remarry, because they have, at least at that point, until the marriage has been annulled, in understanding that they have a bond, a spiritual bond given by Christ to this couple with someone else. So even though they're not living together, they are divorced civilly, on a spiritual level, their prior bond is still in question. So until it's declared that they don't have this bond, they're not free to marry another. This gets a lot of people all bent out of shape because it seems like the church is saying, well, if you're divorced, you're being punished. That is not what it is. It's rather, if you're divorced and then choose, without an annulment, to go get married anyways, you are, as Jesus says, committing adultery because you still have a bond to another. The bond can only be released if there is proof of annulment, so the bond was actually never there to begin with, or the spouse dies, obviously. And Jesus says this, if a woman's husband dies, she is free to marry another, because we can't make the bond of marriage extend to death, because Jesus says they're not given or taken in marriage in heaven. So that would be prior bond to a person. The actual prior bond to the church or something like that actually comes a little bit later in a different impediment. So another impediment can be disparity of cult. And maybe a better way of saying this is disparity of religion. So that the marriage between a baptized Catholic and an unbaptized non-Christian or an unbaptized person is invalid unless it is given a formal declaration of dispensation by the bishop. So that if a man who is baptized, practicing Catholic, meets a woman, she's not practicing anything, she's unbaptized, and they go to get married, present themselves to the priest, she lies that she is baptized, and the priest maybe isn't good, so he doesn't check, she just kind of trusts them, or he just kind of goes and says, we'll do it anyways. That disparity of cult and this is originating out of the divine law, not the church just, hammering down more rules. The divine law, God says, warns Israelites multiple times about intermarriage, that bond cannot be formed because there is not a sharing in the spiritual life. However, it's not totally possible to validate this marriage. It is invalid if no dispensation is granted by the bishop, but if it is, and this can be given by the bishop for reasonable causes. If he thinks that this person who is yet unbaptized has a hope of being baptized, or that the Catholic party is very clear that they will raise the children in the faith, and that if there comes a time when the other person refuses, they will then remove the children from the circumstance. The non-Catholic party is aware that the Catholic has obligations to the church and to the raising of their children, and that both parties are clear in working together. That it's not just going to be one kind of doing their thing and the other kind of doing their own thing, and they just kind of coexist in their different faiths, but rather they're still working together. Even if the one never converts, but their still aim is the promotion of Catholicism in the home and for the children. If the bishop, through maybe the priest's presentation to him, can see that this seems pretty reasonable, that these things will happen, then he'll grant a dispensation. If no dispensation is granted at all, though, then the marriage, even if it's declared in vows or before a minister, it's invalid. So the next impediment is sacred orders or ordination. Well, this is pretty obvious. You got someone who's a priest and they try to get married, they can't. You might have heard, like in the news, like priests leaves the church and gets married to a woman. Well, that's actually improper language. It would say he's attempting to marry the woman, but he can't, because he, through his consecration, through his acceptance and reception of holy orders, this is for priests and bishops, cannot get married. They have on their soul an imprint, a mark that sets them aside for Christ only. And they are not free to be married. Now, you might hear, well, what about priests who are kicked out of the priesthood? Well, they probably can get married, right? Well, no. There actually has to be a double declaration by the Pope that allows a man who was ordained a priest to be married, because the dismissal from the clerical state, from being a priest and acting like a priest, does not include dismissal from the vow to celibacy. And only the Pope can declare that through a bishop. So that a priest might be removed from his duties by a bishop, but he is not free to start going dating or married until the Pope has also declared you are dismissed from your vow of celibacy. Until then, even if he tries to get married, the marriage would be considered invalid. Now, what about deacons? They're not priests or bishops yet, so does this apply to them at all? This rule applies to widowed permanent deacons. So if a deacon is married, when he becomes a permanent deacon, that's fine. But if his wife dies, he is not free to remarry. That's part of the understanding of the order of the diaconate. So the same thing would apply for him. Okay, well, the next impediment is a permanent perpetual vow, or a permanent solemn vow. So this would be for religious, and this applies to both men and women. Ones who have declared publicly and accepted by the church a vow of permanent, perpetual chastity through a particular type of religious organization. So there are different ranks, and this is like a really long canon law, like whole spiel that I don't feel like getting into, but there are different ranks of what qualifies as religious order. And there are some that are called like religious institutes or like fraternities, or not sororities, but societies of common life, of religious common life. Those don't actually meet the requirements for a true religious organization. One that does is one that is declared by the church as one of a true religious institute with a formal constitution of life. What does all that mean? Doesn't matter. All that being said is, if a member of that order, so for us, that applies to me. The Benedictines, my life here at St. Vincent is under a religious institute with a constitution of life. if one of us tries to go and leave after we have taken our solemn vows, or perpetual vow of chastity, to go and get married, that marriage is invalid. Same for a woman who does the same thing. Now, there can be a indult, which is just another word, fancy word for dispensation, from your vow by your ordinary, so for me, the abbot, or for a women's religious organization, the bishop, that can release you from your vows. And that can take a while, but you can pledge or you can petition to be released from your vows. But until that goes through, and that's been approved, you are no longer free. You don't even have to be living in the community. You can leave before that declaration has been made, but you are not free to engage in dating and being engaged, and any of that, all of that, particularly in marriage alone. It would be, again, an attempting of marriage. So the dismissal, though, is slightly different because unlike the priesthood, where the dismissal from the clerical state and dismissal from chastity are two separate things, once a man or woman is completely dismissed from the religious life, that includes the dismissal from the vows of chastity that are included within it. All right, next. This one gets fun. Abduction. So, if a man kidnaps a woman, forces her to marry him as the means for her to be free, and detains her only until she will give her consent to marry him, there's no marriage. And I mean, that seems like pretty obvious. She doesn't seem to be acting in freedom. Interestingly enough, though, this doesn't apply in the reverse. Not that you probably would see this particularly often, but if a woman kidnaps a man and somehow forces him to marry her in this kind of coercive, abducted state, it's actually still okay. I don't understand canon law in that regard. That's a fun fact. You can go ask a canon lawyer about yourself if you know one. But the reason why this is an impediment, obviously because the woman is not free, but it is that she is entering into marriage not for the purpose of union, but for the purpose of escape. So she alone isn't entering marriage with a choice for union. So now people might be like, well, why is that the reason? Well, it should just be because he kidnapped her. And maybe, but we're looking at the spiritual order of things, and it is union that is fostered in marriage. And if she's not entering into the union of her own accord, but rather as a consequence, then obviously the marriage is invalid. And this kidnapping doesn't necessarily have to be totally physical. There's the abduction. The woman could be taken, said, "You're going to marry me," and then dropped back off at her house and continually blackmailed through this whole process. That is still, because she's being forced somehow in it, not valid. However, if, I don't know, Stockholm syndrome kicks in, and she chooses, after leaving him, that she actually wants to marry him, well, then that marriage is valid. But she can't, in the moment, still being around him and with him, marry him and it still be valid. So, yeah, that's an interesting one. Can't say I've seen that or heard of it, but maybe I have. I don't know. Beauty and the Beast, maybe? Is that something, they're in France. Maybe they're Catholic. I don't know. That's a weird one to ask. I'm getting off topic. Okay, next one. Crime. These are getting spicy. All right. What kind of crime? Well, the intentional and unlawful killing of your spouse for the purpose of marrying someone else. So this could be done meditatively beforehand or after the fact. After, you choose to get divorced with your spouse, and then you marry this other person, and then to not have the other former ex-spouse in your life, you kill them off. So it could be that, or you kill them first and then get married. Either way, it just seems pretty darn obvious. Invalid marriage. The whole circumstances around this thing is screwed up. And it could be one-sided or two-sided. So just the husband, or just the new quote-unquote husband, the guy could kill off his wife, even if the woman that he's interested in is unmarried. He kills off his wife, then marries her, circumstance. Or if they both do it, obviously that makes it even 1,000 times worse. But this is really interesting. Canon law is very particular here. The murder must be done for the sake of marrying someone else. That's what invalidates it. This is not saying that murder is good. This is not saying murder is okay ever. But, for instance, if a man, in a fit of rage, murders a woman, his wife, goes through prison, whatever, then comes out, meets another woman, marries her, their marriage is valid, right? He didn't try to marry this woman, so killed his wife as a result. Rather, killed his wife, then married a woman. Now, horrible circumstance altogether. I would feel bad for that second wife because who knows what's going to happen to her. But he didn't kill his first wife for the purpose of marrying the second. So that's the whole circumstance that's being understood. All right. Next is the impediment of consanguinity. It's just basically a fancy word for bloodline, those whom you are related. There are kind of two ways of looking at consanguinity: direct line and then collateral line or lateral. So direct, grandfather, son, grandson, anyone in your direct line, you are never free to marry. Doesn't matter how far away you are from them, you are never free to marry anyone in your direct line. So that makes it easy. If you do, invalid. Now, if you have your collateral line, there are degrees of what are called consanguinity. So you kind of degrees of separation from this person. So let's look, if you look at your dad or your mom as kind of the point of focus, I am in 1 degree removed from my parents, right? There's also direct line, but I'm 1 degree removed from them. Well, in the lateral space, then, I am 2 degrees, 1 through my mom, and then, boom, down to my brothers and sister. I am 2nd degree from my siblings. Well, that makes me then 3rd degree to my uncles and aunts, so that it's, right, through my mom, then through her parents, then to her brothers and sisters, right? So there's 3 levels there, which makes me 4 degrees removed from my cousins, my first cousins. So 1 through my mom, then 2nd through her parents, 3rd through her brothers and sister, and then down to 4th through her cousin. So that's degrees of consanguinity. Anything up to and including that 4th degree, so including first cousins basically, all of that invalid, off limits. You can't marry first cousins. Now, in most countries, you can't even marry your second cousins either. But according to Canon Law, it is just up to and including the degree of 4 degrees removed, so 4 degrees of consanguinity. Generally, the best way is to just say it. You can't marry your cousin, your first cousin, or anyone else that is within that degree. There's also the impediment, similarly in a way, of an affinity, which this is based on blood relatives through marriage and also adoption. So that if a man marries a woman, the woman dies, he can't marry her mom. You can't marry the direct blood relative of your former spouse. So you can marry her sister, but you can't, because that's not a direct, right? That's 2nd degrees removed. But you can't marry her mom, her grandmother, her daughter. All of these things sound weird, right? And probably like, ugh, shudder. Like, ugh, I don't want to see any of this. But there's a reason for that. This also applies for adoption. So even though an adopted person into a family is not related by blood, the affinity of relationship is assumed. So that an adopted brother cannot marry his adopted sister. So that if a boy is adopted into a family, he can't marry the sister of his adopted family. Affinity on the adoption level only applies to direct line, again, and then to 2nd degree. Because the blood is not exactly the same, right? It doesn't carry that same weight of degree. So your first cousin by normal consanguinity isn't your first cousin by blood at all. So that in adoption, you could marry anything past the 2nd degree. Although, again, no adopted kid, hopefully, is going to marry his adoptive first cousin. Like, that's just weird. But according to canon law, that's allowed. It's just anyone within 2 degrees of collateral or less. And, of course, anyone in your direct line through your adopted parents. So, those are the impediments. Now, there are ways in which those impediments are dispensed, and we can talk about that in other episodes. But for right now, if any of those apply, those are why the church would declare a marriage invalid. So if you learned something today and you're like, wow, canon law actually might have some sense to it, and it doesn't sound as daunting or crazy as I thought it did, or you're like, this is just random and bizarre, go back to other videos, I would love to hear a comment. And if you have questions about what does it mean then if my spouse did have one of these things, or I know someone who that applied to and they got married, whatever it is, if you have questions, feel free to drop. I can't necessarily know the answer to all these, but I know some canon lawyers who might. So, hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you all have a wonderful, God bless day. Adios.